Good evening to all distinguished speakers and participants for the virtual policy dialogues on post-COVID-19 fiscal policy instrument and green development. So my name is Nella Henrietti. I'm the task manager for this event from the ADBI side. The event is a collaboration of ADBI with Fiscal Policy Agency Indonesia Ministry of Finance and LPEM University of Indonesia. So I will be hosting this 3 days event with Ms. Alin Halimatu Sadia from University of Indonesia and Mr. Nur Saifuddin from Ministry of Finance. So it is my pleasure to welcome you here today. I hope you are all safe and healthy. So I will explain some housekeeping to you. So this opening until the introduction for every day, we will streamline that through Indonesia Ministry of Finance website. Swati put the link. So, but if you want to join for the whole event, you need to register to our website. Go to the next slide. So that's ADBI. So register and you will get the links as an attendee. So as a speakers or as a participant, please mute your microphone when you're not speaking, and then you can switch on. It's up to you. You can switch on your video or off the video. But I understand for the attendee, you cannot turn on or off video or microphone by yourself. So if you have a question about technical situation, and then you can leave a message in the chat box. But if you have a question when there's a session, you can leave a message, your question in the Q&A box or raise your hand. So for the attendees, we will give you a right to talk. So we will allow you to talk when you raise your hand. So I think that's from my introduction today. So I thank you for you all for joining us today. So we will start our webinar with the opening remarks from our 3 partners institution. So at this time, first I would like to introduce Dean and CEO of Asian Development Bank Institute, Professor Tetsushi Sonobe. So before his term in ADBI, Dean Sonobe served for 6 years as Vice President of the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, GRIPS in Tokyo. He also previously served as a professor of economics at Tokyo Metropolitan University and GRIPS. Dean Sonobe is a recipient of the Nikkei Book Publication Prize and the Masayoshi Ohira Memorial Prize, and a founding board member of the Japanese Association for Development Economics. So I think without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Dean Sonobe for his opening remarks. Dean Sonobe, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nella. Dr. Febrio Nesan Kakarib, Head of Fiscal Policy Agency, Ministry of Finance, Indonesia. Dr. Riatu Mariatu Kibitia, Head of the Institute of Economic and Social Research, University of Indonesia. Professor Paul Ekin, University College London. Distinguished speakers and moderators, colleagues and friends, ladies and gentlemen, greetings from Tokyo. Welcome to this virtual policy dialogue on post-COVID-19 fiscal policy instruments and green development. I am pleased to provide opening and warm welcome remarks. Just a few years ago, we are worried that the momentum toward green development might be lost because in 2017 and 2018, the world saw global investments in renewables and energy efficiency declined, and according to the International Energy Agency, IEA, global energy-related carbon emissions increased slightly. However, it turned out that around the same period, big tech companies like Amazon, Google, Microsoft, and Facebook began massive investments in renewable energy. More recently, nearly 70 leaders of the world have pledged green recovery, including European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and US President Joe Biden. Hundreds of billions of dollars will be poured in green investments. Moreover, these EU and USA leaders are now talking about imposing levies on carbon-intensive goods imported from abroad. So many other countries will have to think about how to respond to these moves. So these recent developments are encouraging, but we are not entirely happy about them because there remain many policies in many countries favorable to fossil energy policies. And the price systems are far from appropriate ones that should give right incentives toward green development. In Japan, for example, when I buy petroleum or gasoline for my car, I think I would be paying more than $220 US per ton of carbon. But when the power plants buy coal, they pay only $10 US per ton of carbon. And some commentators say that if the carbon price becomes $50 or so to both coal and petrol, Japan could easily reduce its carbon emissions to some extent without losing anything. So it is very timely and relevant to publish a book on the issue of fiscal policy instruments and green development now. To discuss general policy, fiscal policy choices and the implications for sustainable development, green financial instruments, and fiscal incentives, and fiscal administration on a subnational level. For example, Tokyo, the metropolitan government, one of the biggest subnational authority in Japan, has its own cap and trade scheme, and then working very well on the green development issues, but not other regional or prefectural government are following yet. And then the national government is even slower. So and there would be a lot of interesting stories, and not just interesting, but very, very important policy issues about the subnational level. Okay, so I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to Professor Paul Akin for taking initiative in making this important book. And I will also thank Ms. Jacqueline Cottrell for her very energetic support for making this book. And then, of course, I would like to thank all the authors and the speakers. Thank you very much. And I also would like to express my gratitude to keynote speakers, Professor Shunsuke Managi, a distinguished professor, Urban Institute, Kyushu University, and Mr. Jovan Barboza, advisor to ADB, and Naida Krishna Morgado, infrastructure specialist, innovation and green finance at the Southeast Asia Department of ADB. So for this today and for the next 2 days, altogether 3 days, we will have a lot of discussion, and then I really look forward to the fruitful debate and discussions about these important issues. With that, I conclude my opening and welcome remarks. Thank you very much for your attention. over to you, Nela.
Thank you, Dean Sonobe. Now, I would like to introduce you to our next welcome address that will be from Mr. Febrio Nathan Kacaribu. So he is a head of Fiscal Policy Agency from Ministry of Finance of Indonesia, and he is also one of the editors of our forthcoming book. So previously, before his position, his current position, he was the head of LPEM Macroeconomics and Financial Research, and also his areas of expertise include business economics and projection, economics models, financial economics, and monetary economics, and public policy analysis. So he obtained his Bachelor of Economics from University of Indonesia and Master Degree of International and Development Economics from Australian National University, and then a PhD from the University of Kansas. I think without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Kacaribu for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Bu Nela. Mr. Tetsushi Sonobe, ADB Institute, Professor Paul Ekins, University of College London, Professor Sunsuke Managi, Kyushu University, Ms. Riatu Kiptiah, LPM, University of Indonesia. Distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for having me today. The pandemic has set us back several years on various development agendas the world has set out to achieve under the Sustainable Development Goals. IMF report suggested that the pandemic has forced the global economy to suffer a 3.5% contraction last year. In 2022, Indonesia's economy was impacted by the pandemic severely. However, it is expected to recover swiftly in 2021. Indonesia's economic performance shows recovery and is already on the right track. The continuation of Indonesia's economic recovery phase is reflected in the last several quarters GDP number. Back in 2020, overall, we achieved the rate of growth of minus 2.07%, which is comparably quite mild compared to many countries. For example, if you compare with G20 or regional economies. The role of government is still very crucial and was very crucial back in 2020 in supporting economic performance, avoiding deeper economic pressure. This was reflected in government consumption performance, which was the only component that grew positively at 1.8% in the fourth quarter or 1.9% in the full year of 2020. The realization was supported by expansionary fiscal policy with a deficit to GDP ratio reached 6.1%. Even in this contractive zone, other expenditure components such as household in consumption, investment, exports, and imports have shown a gradual improvement up to the last quarter. Recovery is to be expected to continue in 2021, and we should return to the positive zone in line with government stimulus and development of and process of the vaccinations that have been rolled out. On the supply side, several sectors were able to maintain resilience back in 2020. ICT sector, health services sector, each recorded 10.6 and 11.6% growth back in 2020 due to demand was still increasing during pandemic. Agricultural sector and financial services were also among sectors that had positive growth in 2020 in Indonesia. Most of the essential sectors affected by pandemic, like manufacturing, trade, and mining, showing some positive trend in terms of direction, in terms of the recovery. I would like to review just a little bit about our 2020 state budget performance, including the so-called National Economic Recovery Program, PEN, which played a critical role in maintaining purchasing power of our citizens, especially the poor and the vulnerable groups, and the business sector sustainability, especially the micro and small medium enterprises. Social protection was able to keep the poverty rate at the level of 10.19% in 2020, Without the social protection program, the World Bank estimated that the poverty rate would have been 11.8%, meaning that our PEN program, especially the social protection program, estimated to be able to save more than 5 million people from poverty. In 2021, the government continues to strengthen the pandemic handling and economic recovery by continuing various priority policies. We rolled out the mass vaccination program. We still promote the 3M, which in Indonesian it means using mask, washing your hands, and keeping distance, and also 3T, tracing, testing, and treatment. In 2021 fiscal policy direction, we show it is going to be still expansive with deficit at 5.7% of GDP and expected to gradually return to its ceiling of 3% of GDP by 2023. The 2021 state budget is designed to help Indonesia's economy to return to its medium-term growth trajectory. The government will continue to complement and strengthen the role of PEN in 2021. Accordingly, we increased the budget allocation for PEN in 2021 now at 699.4 trillion rupiah. The additional budget is mainly to meet the funding for the vaccination program and job creation programs in 2021. We are optimistic that strengthening PEN will continue to be an important strategy to sustain to a more solid economic recovery this year. The government is also committed to continuing the momentum of structural reform agendas expected to strengthen the foundation of our future global challenges that we are facing, and accordingly we achieve our development goals in the next medium term. Indonesia's government recognizes the necessity of additional capital to sustain our economic growth. Therefore, we undertook breakthrough action through so-called Omnibus Bill of job creation back in 2020, then it is being implemented in 2021. One of the series of breakthroughs was by establishing a sovereign wealth fund called INA, Indonesia Investment Authority. We designed INA based on international best practices, including ensuring the board's independence and flexibility for various investment structures. INA aims to complement the current infrastructure financing strategy with an equity-based investment by co-investing with overseas and local partners. INA aims to attract more investments and play a more active role in improving the Indonesian investment climate. Ladies and gentlemen, despite all of the hardship it brings, the pandemic has provided us with chance to strengthen the structural reform agendas. Remember back in 1998, Asian financial crisis, that was followed by democratization of Indonesia. The foundation of Indonesia Financial Sector Authority was following the 2009 global financial crisis. Today, with COVID-19 pandemic drives us to do a series of structural reforms as well, which already begin with the job creation law that I mentioned above. I believe that the implementation of green recovery will be one of the drivers for the world's economic transformation as well. Indonesia has been and will continue reducing its carbon emission and achieve a climate resilient nation as part of our commitment, part of the structural reforms that we are working on. Ladies and gentlemen, this crisis has put the issues of environment, climate change, and resilience in the center. Climate change has raised the possibility of an outbreak of diseases causing pandemic and public health crisis, similar or even worse to what we are experiencing now. Therefore, the importance and benefits of promoting sustainable green economy today to support future economic growth is really becoming more viable. Policymakers look closely at recovery packages from the perspective of long-term strategies that will build the economy in a more sustainable way, taking into account a just transition in the process. Before the pandemic, Indonesia has laid the foundation for a green economy and made several climate-related strategic policies. Climate change has been mainstreamed into the National Medium-Term Development Plan 2020-2024 within the broader strategy of Low Carbon Development Indonesia, LCDI. To mainstream climate change into public finance management, the Ministry of Finance has developed a mechanism for climate budget tagging and integrated it into the national planning and budgeting system since 2016. Based on the climate budget tagging results, we showed that we have allocated around 3.9% of our budget per year during the period of 2016 to 2020. This budget could cover about 34% of the financing needs to achieve our nationally determined contribution target. Climate budget tagging has enabled the government to raise financing from the market as well. We have regularly issued green bonds in Islamic format, sukuk, since 2018. Green sukuk is an innovative instrument to boost green investment in Indonesia. Indonesia is the first issuer of sovereign green sukuk globally and the first issuer of a sovereign green bond in Asia. So far, we have issued green sukuk amounting at $2.9 billion US, both in global and domestic markets. Green investors' participation in our global sukuk increased from 29% in 2019 issuance to 33.7% for 2020 issuance. We expect that the increasing participation of green investors will be lowering the yield further. On the financing side, the government has issued those sovereign global green sukuk annually since 2018. The net proceeds were allocated to finance sustainable transportation, for instance, double-track railway and energy-efficient vessels, flood mitigation in highly vulnerable areas, access to energy from renewable resources, waste management, and energy efficiency projects across the country. Those projects are expected to reduce emission by around 8.9 million carbon dioxide equivalent. The government has also issued the world's first green sukuk retail in 2019 with a total investment roughly $100 million US. Ladies and gentlemen, to deal with the pandemic, Indonesia allocated $47.9 billion US for fiscal stimulus measures, in which 29% of it goes to social protection schemes, while 42% goes to tax incentives, credit, and stimulus for small, micro, and medium enterprises. The stimulus also includes funding for labor-intensive green projects, such as mangrove restoration project, covering 15,000 hectares and employing roughly 20,000 people in the coastal areas. Looking forward, the government is also considering carbon pricing to reduce emission and raise government revenue to enhance green investment and further developing the climate change fiscal framework, CCFF. The CCFF will set out fiscal policy and strategy, including its use to leverage private finance to meet our nationally determined contribution, our SDGs and low carbon development initiative targets. Through all of these measures, we hope to send a clear message that our fiscal and development policy is heading towards more climate-friendly goals. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to highlight the fact that climate financing for every developing country has always been a big issue. Our second biennial update report back in 2018 stated that Indonesia requires at least $247 billion US, or around $19 billion US per year, to achieve its nationally determined contribution by 2030. In the last 5 years, Indonesia has been able to fund around 34% of its annual national climate finance needs. In order to fill this 66 financing gap, it is imperative for Indonesia to crowd in private financing. The private sector holds a key role in developing and implementing climate projects due to their sector-specific expertise, technology, efficiency, financing, and entrepreneurship. However, we must acknowledge that there are still various risks and challenges for the private sector, such as regulatory barriers and undeveloped financial markets. Thus, it falls upon the government to provide a favorable policy and regulatory framework for the private sector. Indonesia offers various fiscal incentives to enhance low carbon development, including in the geothermal fund to deal with the exploration financial risk. Moreover, the government is also currently drafting two presidential regulations on carbon pricing and purchasing price for renewable energy generation. Various innovative private-public partnership schemes are being developed also to support the private sector further. One of them is the utilization of the blended finance by establishing the SDG Indonesia 1 and also establishing the Environmental Fund Management Agency. In Indonesian, we call it BPDLH. Additionally, Indonesia has established the Sustainable Finance Roadmap, which requires financial institutions to increase their green portfolios. Finally, recently, Indonesia has enacted Omnibus Law on job creation to provide a legislative framework to promote further economic development, trade, and investment while balancing out the environmental concerns. Aside from the government and private sector, the international community clearly plays a key role to mobilize climate financing. To support developing countries' commitments and efforts, developed countries must renew and fulfill the commitment of providing $100 billion per year by 2020, as pledged at the 15th Conference of the Parties in 2009. That being said, Green Climate Fund has shown its commitment to assist developing countries, including Indonesia, to mobilize funds for their climate projects. The government of Indonesia would like to appreciate the GCF's contribution to the recently approved RED Plus worth of $103.78 million that was received and will be managed by our BPDLH. The RBP fund will be used to improve the livelihood of communities living inside or around forest areas through two main activities. First, strengthening the forest management units on forest restoration and business activities, and secondly, enhancing the social forestry program to secure communities' livelihood while preserving the forest. Given its important role, we urge GCF to continue enhancing its significant progress and strengthening its investment portfolio in developing countries, including Indonesia. Together with the private sector, including national banks, we encourage the CGF to further develop innovative financing instruments to boost climate investments. Ladies and gentlemen, as a closing note, I would like to re-emphasize that Indonesia, in the face of the global pandemic, remains firm on its climate commitments. An inclusive green recovery will carry us through a building back stronger. This is how we should and will address the twin challenges of COVID-19 and also climate change. I hope and believe this commitment will also be maintained by countries in Asia and also in the world. We consider that this webinar is an excellent opportunity to further explore various policies and efforts with the same goal. It will be very interesting if we also find new views and references that might support the progress we made so far. I believe that together we can recover from the global pandemic and progress the fight against climate change. Finally, in this opportunity, please allow me to appreciate ADBI and LPEM University of Indonesia for their kind endeavor to initiate the collaboration between education and policymaking institutions. We expect that this cooperation will be getting stronger and stronger and more beneficial in providing future research-based policies. My gratitude also goes to the committee for their tireless effort to make this conference a successful and productive event. Let me congratulate the authors for their participants in this prestigious conference. Thank you very much. Back to you, Bunela.
Thank you very much, Pak Febrio, for your comprehensive explanation how Indonesia tremendous effort to improve our green development. I think your explanation today can be referred for our development about, for the forthcoming book. Thank you very much. So now we go to our next opening remarks. That will be Ms. Riatu Mariatul Kiptia. She's a director for the Institute for Economic and Social Research, LPEM, Faculty of Economics and Business, University of Indonesia. She is also a public finance expert who have involved in various research and projects on Indonesia decentralization, intergovernmental transfer and taxation. She has been involved and some consultant in those areas for development and multilateral organization. She received her PhD degree in economics from Georgia State University, Master of Art from Georgia State University, and Bachelor of Art in economics from University of Indonesia. I think without further ado, I will give the floor to Ibu Riatu.
Thank you, Ibu Nela. Excellency, Professor Tetsushi Sonobe, Dean of Asian Development Bank Institute, Dr. Febrio Kecaribu, Head of Fiscal Policy Agency, Ministry of Finance, Indonesia, Professor Paul Ekins, Professor of Resource and Environmental Policy, Institute for Sustainable Resource from University College London, UK, Mr. Chul Jukim, Deputy Dean of ADBI, Ibu Nela Hendriati from ADBI, Ibu Alin, Head of Environmental Research Group from LPM, Mr. Nur Saifuddin for Fiscal Policy Agency, and Jacqueline Cottrell, and distinguished speakers, discussant, participants of this policy dialogue webinar. It is great honor for me to also welcome all of you to this policy dialogue on fiscal policy instrument for green development, conducted as a joint collaboration between ADBI, Ministry of Finance, Fiscal Policy Agency, and our institute, LPEM FEB-UI, Institute for Economic and Social Research, affiliated to Faculty of Economic and Business, University of Indonesia. Dean Sonobe and Dr. Febrio has provided insight and objective of the importance of green development and how the role of government, as in this case through its fiscal instrument, will be more important going forward. And I would like only to add as a working scheme on fiscal instrument that actually can align with green development need to also be based from research, reflecting also from lessons learned from a similar and different policy that have been adopted in other countries, as well as addressing the need to adapt different regulatory framework and country-specific institution. And of course, adjusting with agencies' response that might be different across country. During this 3-day webinar, policy-related research funding on effectiveness of fiscal instrument adoption, new initiative on tax and expenditures mix, including critical view on country policy strategy and adoption, will be discussed and shared. I greatly appreciate speakers and authors that will share their research in this webinar. Hopefully, this policy dialogue between academics and policymakers to some extent contribute providing solution for better fiscal instruments adopted in respective country and in Asia in general. I would like to thank ADBI that have long addressing and having commitment in this area, as well as Fiscal Policy Agency, Ministry of Finance Indonesia, a key agency in the context of Indonesia Green Development Financing Policy for the collaboration and initiating this book publication. And I wish to all speakers, discussants, and participants of this webinar a fruitful discussion and a joyful webinar. Thank you and good morning all.
Thank you, Bu Riatu, Professor Sonobe, and Pak Febrio for a very inspiring keynote speech. Now we move forward to our keynote address. We have Professor Paul Whitfield Ekins. He's a professor of resources and environmental policy, Institute for Sustainable Resources, University of College London. Besides the keynote address, Professor Paul Atkins is our editor for our forthcoming book. So Professor Atkins has a PhD in economics from University of London and as professor in the same institution. So he has extensive experience consulting for business, government, and its international organization. His academic work published in numerous books, articles, and scientific papers focus on condition and policy for achieving an environmentally sustainable economy, including environmental taxation. So today he will present his keynote address about the environmental taxation in Asia, grasping the opportunities. So I think without further ado, I will I will give the platform to Professor Paul Atkins. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Nella, and it's a huge pleasure to be here. So Professor Sonobe, Dr. Kakaribu, and Dr. Kiptia, and all eminent panelists and authors for this book, which I have the privilege now of being the editor of. It's been a huge pleasure to read the chapters that you are producing. I've learned a lot, and I'm confident that this will be a landmark publication for the region and for the wider world. It's extraordinary to think that it's only 1 year ago that my colleague Jacqueline Cottrell and I were with the Ministry of Finance in Jakarta talking about green taxes and having a really productive dialogue. And unfortunately, that process was interrupted, as so many other processes have been, by the pandemic. But I especially appreciated the earlier remarks of the speakers who stressed that the pandemic must not let us take our sights off the need for a climate neutral recovery. I spent much of the last 3 years being a co-chair of the United Nations Environment Programme's Global Environment Outlook, which was published at the UN Environment Assembly in 2019. And I can tell you from a scientific point of view that COVID is nothing compared to what climate change will do to the world unless we get a grip on it. And that is our task with this book, to formulate policies that will move in that direction. And we know that this is an amazingly important year for this process, because COP26 will be held later this year in the United Kingdom, where all the countries of the world will need to come and show that they take the commitments that they made in the Paris Agreement seriously, and that they will reduce their carbon and other greenhouse gas emissions such that we will reach net zero in 2050, which is what we will need to do in order to keep to the temperature targets that we have all agreed to. And carbon pricing will play an important role in that. And I'm going to share some very quick thoughts with you now about carbon pricing. It's a subject that I've spent at least 30 years on and published a number of books. And I'm very much looking forward to being involved in the production of this book in what is now undoubtedly the most important region of the world, both economically and in respect of climate change. Because make no mistake, the battle against climate change will not be won in Europe. It will be won or lost in Asia, where most people in the world live and where we currently have the world's most dynamic economies that will need to develop in a radically different direction to the direction that the old industrial countries have gone in. So Swati, would you like to just share your screen and bring my slides up, please? And then we can move to the presentation. Thank you, that's great. That's exactly right. So a summary of experience, fiscal policy instruments and green development. The next slide, please. I think we've did we jump a slide there? Yes. So I think all of us who've studied economics, we understand the rationale for environmental taxation and carbon pricing. That market failure has led to excessive pollution and environmental destruction. You will remember that Professor Nick Stern, in his Economics of Climate Change in 2006, called climate change the greatest market failure that the world has ever seen. Carbon pricing is more efficient than regulation, meaning that we get more carbon reduction for less cost, and more effective than voluntary agreements and information. And without significant increases in energy prices, energy consumption will go on rising and energy efficiency will be disincentivized. And I'm sure you all know as well as I do, the enormous opportunities for energy efficiency in all our economies which exist, and the way in which achieving those economies can contribute to economic growth. And where our energy is carbon-based, this will lead to increased carbon emissions and a failure to stabilize the climate in a cost-efficient way. And that is an outcome that we simply cannot contemplate. Next slide, please, Swati. So this is the theory which has been explored in numerous books introducing the concept of environmental tax reform, where we shift taxation from goods like income and profits, where most countries still get most of that taxation from, to bads like resource use and pollution. And that is something taken from the European Environment Agency. And of course, environmental fiscal reform also includes the removal of environmentally harmful subsidies. And the hypothesis, which I've spent about 30 years trying to explore, is that ETR, environmental tax reform, will lead to, as we would expect, less pollution, less resource use, but it will also lead to increased output and higher employment because of the reduction of employment taxes. It can also lead to green innovation and green technology development, and both of those outcomes lead to higher human well-being. And I can only say that all the research I've done over 30 years has made me convinced that this hypothesis is broadly sound. Next slide, please. So carbon pricing is increasing. This is the World Bank's State and Trends of Carbon Pricing from May of last year. It's a complicated diagram, which I will leave you to study at your own leisure, but all the colored areas of the world are areas which are experimenting with some forms of carbon pricing. And it's a great pleasure to me to see Indonesia there as a country that is, as we heard from Dr. Kakaribu, that is considering carbon pricing in the future. Next slide, please. But the current situation is pretty terrible. And this is a diagram which our researchers from University College London produced for the Lancet Countdown in the journal The Lancet, which explores the relationship between global health and climate change. And you will see all those little bubbles are countries which price carbon to some extent. And you will see that the average net price of carbon globally is negative. So not only faced with the largest market failure the world has ever seen, not only do we not try to internalize that externality by pricing carbon positively, we actually continue to subsidize fossil fuels so that we increase carbon emissions beyond their economic optimum. Next slide, please. So during the years 2006-2009, I was engaged in research for the UK Green Fiscal Commission. We produced a number of resources, which I think many of the people on this call may find interesting. these 8 briefing papers on all these various topics, which are quite short, and they try to summarize at that date the state of the art of environmental taxation around the world and the various issues that have arisen. So we looked at public opinion about climate change, we looked at and environmental taxes, we looked at engaged in some modeling of the economic, environmental and social implications of a tax shift. We looked at distributional issues and particularly the impacts of environmental taxation on relatively poor and marginalized people. We looked at international comparisons on the effectiveness of economic instruments. We looked at environmental tax reform and innovation, and environmental tax reform and competitiveness. We looked at the issue of border tax adjustments, and Professor Sonobe, I think very, with a lot of insight, referred to the moves towards making border tax adjustments for carbon purposes, both in the EU and elsewhere, and I think we will see that in the United States as well. We looked at the environmental tax reform and transport, and we looked at the particular issue, which I know ministries of finance are very interested in with regard to carbon taxes, the issue of revenue stability. And we produced these briefing papers on all those topics. And I've also put a reference there to the outcomes of the Canada's Eco-Fiscal Commission. I was very pleased that this was an initiative that arose out of the UK Green Fiscal Commission research. And one of the results of Canada's Eco-Fiscal Commission was the introduction of a carbon tax in British Columbia, which has so far been extremely successful. And they've published this document on the 10 myths about carbon pricing, which I've also found extremely helpful. Next slide, please. So these were our conclusions on the Green Fiscal Commission, and you'll understand that in this short presentation, I can't possibly go through all of them in detail, but I can assure you that there is strong economic evidence behind all these statements. So I'm briefly just going to say them, and then we will move into some question and answers. Environmental taxes work. They do reduce environmental impacts, as the theory suggests that they should do. Environmental fiscal reform is economically neutral or beneficial. It strengthens economies rather than weakens them. Environmental taxes are efficient. They improve the environment at least cost, where there is a cost. They can raise stable revenues. Obviously not indefinitely. If we tax carbon and we get to net zero by 2050, then carbon taxes will not be a major source of revenue. But between now and then, they can make a very useful contribution to public budgets. They would stimulate investment in energy and environmental efficiency and the low carbon industries of the future. We are already seeing the enormous cost reductions in renewable sources of energy in particular, and the fact that more investment is going into these forms of energy than into any other form of electricity. And environmental tax reform and carbon pricing would strengthen that trend. They can mitigate the impact of high world fossil fuel prices by stimulating energy efficiency, and of low fossil fuel prices by including external costs. And at these times when we have relatively low oil prices, we have an enormously good opportunity to introduce carbon pricing in a way that will not have an excessive impact on low-income people. The impacts of ETR on competitiveness can be mitigated, and the whole discussion about border tax adjustments is all about that. And as I say, I'm thinking that it will lead to those kinds of policy instruments around the world. That low-income households need special arrangements, and I've been very pleased to see in some of the papers that I've read for this book that the authors are taking very seriously the need for a just transition, as indeed Professor Sonobe said, and that low-income households must not be the people who pay the cost of climate change mitigation where there is a cost. And then really to recommend green fiscal commissions, to explore the options and to build consensus around environmental taxation. I wrote a chapter on this subject in the book edited by Professor Mori and Professor Lee, both of whom are on this call and who are very eminent Asian experts on environmental taxes in the region. And I'm glad to see that they too will have papers in this book. Next slide, please, Swati. Okay, so this is the final slide, and give the lessons on carbon and environmental taxation. So they are not a magic bullet for reducing greenhouse gases. We will need to do lots of other things in policy terms. They need to be supplemented with regulations, especially for energy efficiency, for example, and innovation support. But, and this is an important but, they are an essential component of a cost-effective emissions reduction strategy. Countries that seek to reduce emissions without the use of carbon taxes will end up paying more for their emissions reduction than they need to do. National and fiscal contexts are important for implementation. And I would be the first to say that every country must find its own way to carbon taxation to suit its own context and its own circumstances. But general rules about good practice in public finance, for example, in respect of hypothecation, which is a subject that always comes up when we talk about carbon taxation, apply. And the broad lessons from experience with carbon taxes, and there's been more carbon tax experience and carbon pricing experience than in respect of any other environmental issue, they can be read across to other environmental taxes, but these taxes too need to be analyzed, designed, and implemented on a case-by-case basis to consider all the issues that I've mentioned here. And I've been enormously impressed with the thoroughness and rigor with which the Indonesian Ministry of Finance is looking at these issues, in the recognition that this is not easy economically, it's not easy administratively, it's not easy above all politically to get consensus in the populations of these countries that we need carbon taxation, but the benefits for the economy can be very great, and of course the benefits for the climate, which is what we're primarily doing it for, can be enormous. So next slide, please. I think that's the end of the slides, and very much looking forward, if we have time, to any questions.
Thank you, Professor Paul Ekins. We have one question actually. Maybe because we are a bit behind schedule, maybe we limit our Q&A. But I hope you can answer this. This is from Frida Murti Namasivayam. So the plight of energy poor in developing countries is a critical political issue. Millions are today not consuming any modern energy. Has any studies have been done on the impact of carbon tax on the poor? So he said, next, I understand there's a design to give back the tax to poor. Has it been done in any part of the world? And what are the learning? If you can answer that in less than 1 minute, Professor Paul Ekins. Thank you.
Well, thank you. That is an enormously important question. And I can say that anyone who doesn't address that issue but introduces a carbon tax is going to find that there is a lot of political pushback from it. The answer to your question is yes. There have been a number of, in fact, I would say most of the introductions of carbon taxes in the countries that have introduced them have had some kind of payment and compensation mechanism back to low-income people. I would stress that the first thing to do, obviously, is to remove subsidies for fossil fuels, because there are many studies from the IEA and from the International Monetary Fund and others that show that if you want to support low-income people with their energy costs, the worst thing to do is to give subsidies to everybody, because the most people who use most energy are not the poor people, they're the rich people. And therefore, with your subsidy, you could far more effectively support poor people with their energy costs by doing it directly rather than subsidizing fossil fuels for everybody. And there are lots of good studies about that, which I can refer people to if they're interested in that. But certainly, in the way that the UK introduced a carbon tax in the early years of this century, that was a revenue neutral tax. So all the taxes were returned to, in fact, through the reduction of income tax and social security payments. And that will have had a larger effect on relatively poor people than on relatively rich people. But also, there was a scheme set up to directly compensate low-income households for their energy bills through the utility companies. These schemes can be administratively complicated, and every country has to design its own because we all have our own social security systems, but it is an enormously important element of any carbon tax reform, and I'm very grateful for that question.
Thank you very much, Professor Paul Atkins. I think for if there's more question, you can still put in the Q&A box, but we will answer that by writing to you later on. Thank you very much, Professor Paul Atkins, and please join me to give applause to.
I see, Nella, that Professor Sonobe has put his hand up. I don't know whether.
Okay, okay, Professor.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Yeah. So now, yeah, I completely agree with you. All points of your argument, and especially one of the conclusions that carbon tax is an essential component. And then now all the government across the world have even bigger government deficit, bigger government debt. So can we say that this is a kind of can be a political push in favor of carbon tax because government needs more tax revenue, or we should not rely on such a kind of temporary political push when we are talking about long-term important issue like carbon tax? What's your view?
Well, I think that's a very good question. And I think what I would say is that the arguments for carbon pricing, carbon taxation are very strong at any time. But obviously, they have to be evaluated by ministries of finance in the context in which they find themselves. I think for the next year or two, countries are going to be much more concerned with getting out of the lockdowns and getting back into economic recovery. So they will be more interested in spending money than they will be in taxation. And it is really important that that money, excuse me, that money is spent in ways that invest in low carbon infrastructure and low carbon assets that will build the industries of the future. So I think that's my main priority. But you're quite right, Professor Sonobe. Countries will need to raise revenue in order to get their fiscal balance back on track. And it would certainly be far preferable to raise some of that revenue through carbon taxation than it would to increase income taxes, for example, which are a direct tax on employment. And the whole stretch of the recovery has to be to get people back to work. So I think when governments do start thinking about taxation, then I think carbon taxes are a very logical thing for them to be looking at. They need to put in place measures to make sure that low-income people do not suffer. But as I've said, most energy and most fossil fuel energy is used by the middle classes and the upper classes. And these are the people who can be taxed, who will then change their behavior to move towards more renewables, etc., and reduce emissions as well. So I think that would be a very good strategy.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Paul Atkins, Dean Sonobe. I know that will be many questions I saw in Q&A box, but I think we will answer that in writing. For that, thank you very much, Professor Paul Atkins. And then we move to our photo session. So please to everyone to open their video, to the speakers, to the panelists, open their video. Swati and Misuzu in the screen will take a picture of screenshot for all of us. Pak Nur, is that Pak Febio behind the scene, behind the camera? But if not, that's okay. We can take. Okay, Swati, Professor Socio, yeah. Okay, Swati.
Thank you, everyone. It will just take a few seconds.
Okay. Thank you, Swati. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Swati. I think now we go to the introduction to our book, Fiscal Policy Instrument and Green Development. Here we have Jacqueline Cottrell, and she's a freelance associate in Green Budget Germany, and she helping us. She assists us in put together, the book, set up the, it's kind of like a wonderful help to us. So she's a consultant specializing in green fiscal policy, green budgeting, and inclusive green economy. She delivers policy advisory